Hello and welcome to Féile on Phobail 2020 West Belfast Talks Back. I'm Allison Morris and I'm the security correspondent and columnist with the Irish News. And because we have to do things a little differently this year, two of our panellists are joining us virtually. We have Labour MP Conor McGinn and Sinn Féin TD Louise. I'm also joined by Unionist commentator Julianne Corr and businessman and part-time Unionist commentator Glen Bradley. I think that if we look back at this year, no matter what, we will always be remembered for one thing. This is the year of the pandemic, the year of the lockdown. So what I have found most interesting as a journalist working during this time and covering this is that on these two very small islands, we have 5 different political administrations, sometimes working together and sometimes working autonomously. But what we've managed to see is that all of those regions have fared quite differently when it comes to both the response and the outcomes for the pandemic. So I think it's interesting that we're joined by both Louise and Conor, because I'd like to start with you, Conor, and say, first of all, sort of how have you found the lockdown? And secondly, when you look back at the Boris Johnson administration, the response at the very beginning to the pandemic, maybe delays in lockdown, and what has happened since and what we're still seeing now, how do you think that people will view that, given that England has had obviously one of the worst outcomes in Europe?
Well, look, I think what we've seen here, and in the northwest of England, this is very topical because we have slowed the lockdown in Greater Manchester, which is the region next to me. I'm in Merseyside and then further up into Lancashire just in the last 48 hours because we've had a spike in some areas. But the worrying thing for me is that the people that have been tasked with coming up to the strategic response to this crisis are the people who have created the conditions for it being so profound and so bad and having such a terrible impact on communities like mine. And the reason that I say that is because what we've seen over the last few months is the heroic efforts of workers on the front line and local authorities in our NHS, in the police and in other services, the efforts of the community and volunteers and organisations to come together to provide assistance and help for those in need. But they've all had to do that in the context of having 10 years of austerity and cuts, where essentially the tools that they would need to prepare for such an event, albeit unprecedented, but an emergency of this kind, have been taken from them. So that's been incredibly difficult. And you have to think that in a region like mine in Merseyside, the economic impact as well as the health impact will be felt very acutely and disproportionately here. Look, on a personal level, like everyone else, it's been surreal in some respects. Look, I've really missed being able to get home. Thankfully, Alison, you'd be glad to hear I'm able to read the Irish News every day online, although it's dates and the GAA, I think, before I get to you and the news and the columnists. But being able to keep in touch has been important. But look, as somebody with 2 young kids who've been off school, somebody who's used to being away and working away from home during the week, and my wife and I are both busy people, having to adopt to being at home has been tough, I think. But seeing the resilience of the community here in St Helens has been incredible as well. I think also as a politician and a representative, you feel, as well as the responsibility for your friends, your family, your loved ones, your neighbours and all of that worry, you then take on the burden and anxiety of the 100,000 people in your constituency, the businesses, the older people, the workers in the health service and other frontline agencies. So look, it's been really tough, and it's a tough and long way to go. I think the political consequences of it will only begin to be felt when we're able to analyse it properly, because at the minute the key thing is still beating the virus.
Yeah, Louise, at the very beginning of the pandemic, obviously we had a caretaker government in the south. We now have the new coalition government. There was a lot of talk, obviously, at the very beginning about how our outcomes would be better if we had an all-island health approach to this in terms of closing schools. There were some arguments over that. How do you think? I mean, the South has fared quite well, and our island as a whole has fared quite well compared to most other places. What do you think the strengths and the weaknesses have been in relation to that?
Well, I think the strength that we have as an island is, really derived from how much we can act as a single epidemiological unit. Right, that's a word I can say, but I cannot spell it. But we all know what it means. So I think if the greater the cooperation, the greater chance we have of maximising the benefits of being a small island. So we only have to look at New Zealand. Now look, you can't draw a direct line comparison because New Zealand has no neighbours for 5,000 miles, and we know all of that. However, they did make the most of the benefits of being an island, and I think that that's where we see the strengths. When we see that cooperation happening, when we see the North-South cooperation happening, I think that's when you see us at our best. And I think that's, you know, politics aside, that's how we have to and we should behave. As for the purposes of a public health emergency, I think it was really important. I was disappointed to see that there wasn't wholesale cooperation, that there were times when there was a divergence, but I do think that the strengths were found when we all acted together. You know, I mean, on a personal level, I'm, you know, the same as everyone here. You're a public figure and you do your work and you do all of that, and then you have to deal with, you know, I didn't see my grandson for nearly 5 months, and I found that really hard. I found that really, really hard. In fact, when I did eventually get to see him, I hugged him so hard. He actually whispered in my ear, he's like, "Louise, I'm not actually a teddy bear, you know," because I just gave him such a squeeze. And I think that, you know, there was something that was it was a leveler. The virus. We all missed our family. We all missed hugs. We all wanted to, no matter who you are or where you're from, you know, we all had that collective experience, and we experienced it personally and in our families as well. And I think for those of us in public life, we tried our best to lead by example, and to do the right thing. But I think it was, I don't think we're going to see the full extent of the impact that this has had on us, on people and on their mental health for at least another few months, if not years. I think we will be feeling the impact of this, the loneliness, the isolation. And, you know, there were a few positives. One of the things that I do as the party spokesperson on workers' rights, something that I very much welcome, is we've now redefined what is and what isn't essential work. So the person who is a low-paid worker working down in the supermarket, they were out there on the front line of COVID-19 just as much as nurses and doctors, you know, the people working in supply chain management. And that's something I think we can take from it, you know, that we can redefine those roles that we would maybe have considered, you know, less skilled or semi-skilled or low skilled, and we look at those people now and go, actually, they are the people that keep us going. They're the ones that keep the food flowing, that keep us fed, that keep the lights on. And I think we've a newfound respect for those workers right across the board, and I think that's really, really a very welcome development.
I mean, at the start I had elderly parents, and I found them the most difficult to control. You know, they say the sort of Belfast equivalent of the Blitz spirit is, I live through the troubles, I'll be fine. And you're saying, you know, no, this is not the troubles, missus, this is a pandemic. Could you please stay in the house? And I had to move houses halfway through because I got a death threat halfway through the pandemic and had to move to a different household, which meant I did get to hug my grandchild because then I became part of her bubble. So I moved in there. But I mean, I kept on thinking at the start, how privileged I was because I had a job which I knew was going to keep on going. I mean, news was very important at that time. I had a home, I had money enough to take care of myself and make sure that my children were okay. And my position of privilege was something that I wouldn't have had if you'd have went back to, you know, teenage Allison, the single parent in a flat. My budget would have been worked out to 50p. And I kept thinking, there's people living now the way I was living then, and how are they going to get through this? Not just economically, children being at home from school all day, needing fed all day, heating and electric having to be on all day, but the mental health problems of that. And I know, Julianne, that you speak really openly about the impact of that, and you do have 2 very small children that you were caring for during lockdown. How did you find it, and what do you think that we need to do to make sure that the mental health impact of that doesn't have such serious repercussions? Yeah. I keep thinking we started the year talking about a mental health crisis, and then it's as if it disappeared when clearly it didn't.
Well, it's going to come back with a vengeance, really. It's going to bite us when we least expect it. I mean, for me, I've always been an open book with regards to my mental health, but never in the last 15 years have I required any sort of medicinal support. But I had to reach out to my doctor halfway through the first few weeks of the pandemic with anxiety that I just couldn't cope with. It materialised physically, where I couldn't sleep properly. I had sweaty palms, the palpitations that I was experiencing. And I guess to a degree, my temperament was quite low. I wasn't able to hold my temper. And that's really unhealthy and quite toxic in an environment where you've got two very small toddlers running around, myself and my wife, both working from home at that stage. I had to take on a part-time role to try and support the family as I'm self-employed and didn't benefit at all from the government schemes. So that took a real knock-on effect on my mental health. And I have no shame in saying that I went to the doctor for support and help, and I'm on medication, which is helping me. But I also worry for our healthcare professionals. My mum, for example, she works in the Mater Hospital, and she has worked in care work for years, for as long as I can remember. And of course, you see death as a care worker, but when you see it on the scale that people in hospitals see it, and specifically with something that is undocumented, they're learning about it as it happens, and where no family members are around people to comfort them or support them, there's a level of trauma there. And I worry about the trauma of our healthcare workers, particularly if we do end up in a second wave. We have no idea what this is going to look like if it comes back, which inevitably it will, but on what scale. So I think we're going to have long-term repercussions in terms of mental health. People, particularly within working class communities, have found themselves in unprecedented hardship. I think we'd actually had a discussion on Twitter not that long ago as well about, the reopening of the shops, and a lot of the parents at home rushing out to try and get clothes for kids where, they'd outgrown clothes in that period. And obviously you're at home, so you're wearing a lot more of your casual clothes than your school uniform. The household bills went up, they still kept coming, and the income was less. So people have experienced a hardship that they haven't felt before, emotions that they haven't felt before, and a fear that's new for everyone, but you still feel that you're isolated, that you're alone. And to a degree, there would have been people out there within the community that were reliant on food parcels when they've never relied on anything. And for that, for some people, can feel really degrading.
It is, and I had one friend who was furloughed and her wages were already very low, so you take them down to 80% and they were nothing. And she, at one stage, had to rely on and she actually cried when she was telling me that she'd had to rely on a food bank. And you have all of that sort of hardship that's been, and people feel guilty when they shouldn't, because it was obviously these were circumstances not of our making. I also have relatives who work in care homes, and I know how they were treated, how low they're paid, how little PPE they were given. And it enraged me when I could see, members of the Tory cabinet saying, protect the NHS, and standing clapping at their front doors, on a Thursday afternoon. I think it was you that privatised those care homes. It was you that stripped them of the resources. It's you that has people working, agency workers working in such low pay, and have people who I am related to going in and standing, as you said, looking after old people who couldn't get to see their relatives and who were confused and didn't know why they couldn't get to see their relatives. And so their job became completely different, but yet their wages never changed. Yeah. They were working in such awful circumstances for the same pitiful amount of money. Glen, obviously as a businessman, the economy, you will have seen at first hand how when our world becomes very small and travel and everything closes down, what an impact that has in the global economy, because I know that's something that you would have worked internationally. But also, how do you then start to rebuild that? We have to have this fine balance of, health before wealth, but let's face it, people's health is attached to their financial situation. So the two things go hand in hand. How do you think we should move on, and how do you think that it's been handled so far by our Department of the Economy and Finance here, and also in Westminster in regards to the help that they were given out? Did they think it got to the places it needed to?
A lot of questions there. I think how the Boris Johnson cabinet and the Tory government managed it initially was a diabolical mismanagement, is the only way I can describe it. The ripple effect out of Wuhan started in December. It wasn't that no one didn't know that this wasn't coming. And I think how Johnson, in particular, as an individual and someone who is meant to be the leader of a country, behaved and got on in the early stages of this pandemic was a pathetic disgrace. He did not set any positive or constructive role model example. And I think that is why we have suffered, the UK has suffered one of the worst casualty rates in Europe and in the world. Coming back to how the Northern Ireland Assembly managed it, I have to agree with Louise. We are one landmass. We should have been following and coordinating more closely with the Southern Irish government to protect this landmass that is Ireland, rather than this tinkering and bickering and politicising in Orange and Green about let's follow what Johnson's doing and what the Tory party's doing and let's do this and let's do the other. You know, we should have just went, this is one island landmass. We need to follow what is best to protect us, because this is a killer. This pandemic is something that is going to destroy lives, has destroyed lives, is destroying lives, and will continue to destroy lives until we find a cure, a vaccine for it. And people need to get their heads around that. It's unseen, but it's a killer, and it is going to harm people and destroy them. Getting to the situation of furloughs, I was actually happy with the British government's response to the furloughing and supporting workers. I think when it eventually got up and running, it is working. It could have been done a lot better, and of course with the benefit of hindsight again, but I think it was the civil service bureaucracy that slowed it down rather than necessarily what government direction was.
It was a very interesting day that day when the Chancellor made the statement about the furlough and how government was going to pay 80% of the wages, and it was driving along listening to it thinking, my God, we all now live in the communist republic of the United Kingdom. It was like, does everybody now work for the government? But it was such a strange thing for a Tory minister to do, but I suppose it shows the seriousness of the situation, and they knew that if that didn't happen, it would have just been mass unemployment and hysteria. Yeah,
but again, it is 80%, it is capped, you know, so if you are a high wage earner, you know, and you're getting capped at 80% of your, £2,550 gross per month. For some people, and I may not be appreciative for that, that's a serious decline in their wages. There's people who couldn't manage. So there was poverty being created in some households. And I mean, if I take our own example, my place of employment immediately went to putting staff on work from home as a safety measure in principle. But the likes of my wife was put on to furlough and only returned to work at the start of June. So on a personal level, we sort of, the first 2 weeks probably treated it a bit like a holiday. I was working from home, everything was cushy. But then a bit like Julianne said, I think certainly with me, as someone who was ill and who would suffer from PTSD, after about the third, fourth week, I started finding it incredibly difficult. Now, I'm blessed to live in a nice house with a lovely garden, but if I hadn't had that garden, I honestly don't know how I personally would have managed to cope. And as it stands today, we are still working from home because of the government advice, you know, do not work, go into work unless it is absolutely necessary. But that's...
We all remain. I remain working from home. Who would have known you could put a newspaper out remotely? Like, I remember when they told us all to go home thinking this is just not going to work. And now that it has, it makes me wonder, is all our working lives going to change going forward anyway? Now, the boss knows that, you know, if you work in a huge building, why would you pay for that building when people can work from home? But you're saying just because you can't doesn't mean you should. I don't think it's good for us as people to be isolated in our own homes during our working day. If this pandemic had not have happened, I would still be writing every single day about Brexit and the consequences of Brexit and what's going to happen when the trade deal is or isn't done come January. The impact of that just in terms of all our lives, I think it's going to be quite stark when it eventually does hit. At the minute, obviously we're distracted by other things. Boris Johnson's already said he won't delay that this will still go ahead in January despite calls for him maybe to try and ask for an extension given the situation that we have been in. I think, Louise, it's very specifically important because we did have very good relations north and south when it was coming to those very initial early days of the Brexit negotiations. We had no assembly, so I think that we all looked to Dublin to represent the people of the north. We now have a coalition government, and let's not, you know, dance around it. Micheál Martin is no fan of Sinn Féin, and he will now have to obviously work with Sinn Féin in government in the north as the Taoiseach in the south. How do you think that is going to work, that relationship?
He absolutely will, and I have to tell you, it is a matter of supreme indifference to me as a Sinn Féin TD what Micheál Martin's opinion about me or my party is, but he has a job of work to do. He is the Taoiseach. It is his job to work with the government, north and south. And, you know, I mean, I think the answer to the question, what did we all talk about before we talked about COVID, is Brexit. And it's hard to remember a time when we were all so consumed with it, but it's coming. And, one of the things that we know is that time moves quickly. You think you've a lot of time, and then all of a sudden, blink of an eye, and it's going to be January. I would be concerned, of course, I would, about the prospect of a no-deal Brexit. I think that's the absolute worst outcome for anybody. I'll say it because it should be said. The people in the North voted to remain, and I think that there should have been more scope for respecting that vote and that mandate. That said, the British government are pushing ahead with it. I think the time is very, very tight. I mean, as someone said to me the other day, they were describing the time during the lockdown as the days are long, but the weeks are short. So, you get up in the morning, it takes a long, long time to get through the day, and then you blink and it's like, my God, it's August already. So I think the time from now till January is extremely tight, and I would say it will be very difficult to conclude that deal, notwithstanding what Mr. Johnson says. Well, you're right in what you say. Micheál Martin is the Taoiseach. He needs to put aside any personal feelings that he might have about Sinn Féin and work with Sinn Féin in government, and also work with Sinn Féin as the largest opposition and the lead opposition party in the Dáil. There is no divergence in terms of the views. We want to get the best outcome for our island, and I don't think there's anyone, north or south, that would disagree with that. And Brexit is one of those things that managed to unify the Dublin Parliament in terms of all of the parties. I think we were all on the one page with regard to Brexit, and I think Micheál Martin's job now is to ensure that he represents the interests. I believe the interests of the whole island, in all of the work that he does. But to me, January is coming. It's going to come very, very fast. We have Christmas in the middle of it, although none of us, I think, have any idea what Christmas is going to look like or how it's going to be celebrated. But the pandemic will still be with us by then. But the time is very, very short for any agreement to be reached. And it strikes me that it's going to be very, very tough to get it done in a short space of time.
And Louise, obviously, when Brexit first happened, there was talk that this would obviously advance any border poll or advance calls for Irish unity, given the massive economic impact that it was likely or predicted to have in the north. Micheál Martin's already ruled that out. I think that the programme for government, you could see, looking at that coalition government are looking more towards trying to repair relations with London than they were looking towards Stormont. In relation to that sort of unity project, do you still, well, we know what Sinn Féin's position on that is, but is it still be your opinion that Brexit will advance the calls that people will insist that there be a border poll sooner, maybe rather than some people would prefer?
Well, I mean, look at the pandemic and what it has done. It has brought into stark relief the fact that when we act as an island, we are stronger. And, the call for a border poll is secondary to the call for a mature and rational conversation about a united Ireland, about what it would look like, about how it would function. And I think we're at that stage now. It is an issue that people talk about. It is an issue that comes up on the doors, north and south, obviously. And it is something that I think people are talking about now. And those conversations are happening. They're happening around the kitchen table. They're happening, obviously, in a socially distanced way with the pandemic. But those conversations are happening. Sinn Féin is part of those conversations. Of course, we are. But what Brexit did, I think, for a lot of people, was it brought into fairly sharp focus the need for us to act as an island. And also, I think, people had that conversation north and south about the benefits of being in the European Union and how. And I would be someone, and known in my party as someone who would be very critical of the European Union. But I think the notion that people would be taken out of it against their will, I don't think that's that well with people. And I think, the conversations on an all-island economy, just as the conversations on an all-island health service, as the conversations on an all-island epidemiological unit are happening, those conversations won't be stopped just because they might make Micheál Martin feel a little bit uncomfortable, or they might make him have to do a U-turn on something that he said. We've seen in the first couple of weeks of his coalition government, U-turn after U-turn after U-turn. So it wouldn't be news and it wouldn't be new if Micheál Martin was to reverse a position. But I think rather than excluding ideas and excluding discussions. What he should be doing is trying to be open and inclusive in those conversations. And I think until that happens, he's going to be out of step with the vast majority of people on this island.
And Conor, in Westminster, it's not only the talk, obviously, of what impact Brexit was going to have in terms of Ireland, but Scotland as well. So did you before, obviously the pandemic, was that talk of the damage that this was doing to the Union key within Westminster? And we've seen in terms of the pandemic and how Nicola Sturgeon specifically has handled that Scotland is becoming increasingly autonomous. They're doing their own thing in more ways than one. So this isn't just about, the breakup of the Union in terms of the Irish question, but also in terms of the Union in general. Is that something that you think that the Brexiteers were aware of, or is it something that you think that their mind is so narrowly focused on Brexit that they hadn't taken into consideration?
Well, look, I think there's a lot in all of that. I think firstly, in terms of Brexit, it hasn't gone away, and we are now past the point whereby an extension can be granted. So if there isn't a deal reached by the required date of the 31st of January, there will be no deal. I think in terms of my priority around Brexit, it's ensuring that the jobs, the businesses, the workers and the livelihoods of people in my constituency and across the UK are protected. And in order for that to happen, we need a comprehensive deal. I think the problem with the Prime Minister's approach is it's like a cross between Mary Poppins and Dennis Norden. The hyperbole about everything being supercalifragilisticexpialidocious on one day, or on another day, this idea that it'll be all right on the night. I mean, this is going to provide a fundamental shock to our economy. And on the basis of what we are going through with the pandemic and how that has completely, as Louise alluded to earlier, changed the whole concept of work, what work is valued, what professions are valued, how the economy is structured and what jobs are available to people. And sadly, a lot of people are unemployed, they just don't know it yet, because as the furlough scheme comes to an end, it's going to be impossible to save all those jobs. So what we need to concentrate on is saving workers and ensuring that we don't have a repeat of what we had in places like St Helens and the north of England in the 1980s, when whole industries were swept aside, and primarily men, but also the impact it had on women, were left for generation after generation, essentially because the state didn't provide any route back into employment for them. So that's that. Look, on the sort of spicy topic of the impact on the Union, it's interesting that the conversation around the impact on the Union on Brexit was related to the island of Ireland and Northern Ireland. In terms of the impact on the Union in relation to the pandemic, it's primarily been around Scotland and to a lesser extent Wales, and how the devolution settlement 20 plus years on from the Scottish Parliament and the Welsh Assembly, now the Welsh Parliament being created, these tensions between those component parts on what seemed like very anodyne domestic issues around things like health and education have become really hot political potatoes between the three administrations here in Britain. In terms of Ireland and Northern Ireland in particular, I just felt frustrated throughout the Brexit negotiations, partly because of the arithmetic at Westminster, but also because of the constitutional focus of politics and how the discourse had regressed so much in the north itself because you didn't have an assembly, that actually, because of the investment the European Union had made in the peace process, had made through Objective 1 status, like we had here on Merseyside in Northern Ireland, around creating all that employment and providing a path to prosperity, that the EU probably would have given Northern Ireland the best of both worlds. So it could have lent into the EU structure and it could have lent into a UK structure. What has happened, frankly, is that the government here at Westminster has talked out of both sides of its mouth to unionism particularly. And what we're faced with now is the Ireland Protocol becoming the default mechanism and checks between GB and Northern Ireland in terms of trading the economy. And that is not a good thing for anybody in Northern Ireland, by the way, just as checks between the North and the South wouldn't have been good for the economy, but my contention always was that they would have been much worse for the total context of the peace process in terms of erecting borders on the island of Ireland. But look, there is no good outcome to this for anybody, and sorry to sound so pessimistic, but it's now about making the best of a very bad situation and trying to mitigate the shock that will be felt by the economy after what we're going through with this pandemic as well.
In terms, Juliana, of unionism, and we know that when we look at the breakup of how the Brexit vote broke down, that nationalists mainly voted to remain and unionists mainly voted to leave. But since then, there was, what has been called, the Boris Betrayal Act, the talk that there now will be what will amount to a sea border and checks here, and we will have a different arrangement. From a unionist point of view, and for just the psyche of unionism, is that unsettling? Do people find that terrifying or frightening? And what has been, how do you think the reaction of your community has been to that?
I think, to be honest with you, and I'll be totally upfront, I think I'm kind of out of touch and out of tune with when it comes to how the unionist community as a whole is feeling. So whilst I identify as unequivocally and unashamedly as a loyalist, I don't particularly represent that constituency. So my views are my own and my opinions my own. Personally, I am absolutely terrified at the prospect of a no-deal Brexit. Particularly because it's been estimated that there's going to be potentially a 45% increase on everyday goods under basic WTO rules, that those who are currently living below the breadline will exponentially grow, that food, fuel and financial poverty that exists will potentially be the most, I suppose, unprecedented in terms of any point in history of the last 100 years, the worst that we've ever seen. So there is certainly concerns there about what the material well-being and the socio-economic wealth would be of people within the working class community, who are most likely to be hit hardest by a no-deal Brexit and the fallout from that, and as well as community relations too with an Irish sea border that is unacceptable to unionists. So what will be the fallout from that? I don't want to speculate. On one hand, with Boris Johnson saying, it won't be happening, but yet the experts are saying it will. So you've got this, I suppose, a balancing act, but an Irish state border will likely tip those scales. And I would be concerned about what would happen with community relations in Northern Ireland if that were to happen.
Obviously, this is something that's key to your business and key to how you operate. It's now looking increasingly likely that we're going to end up crashing out with no trade deal. What impact does that have in terms of global trade? I know that some people have said that it provides opportunities and others that it provides, it's going to cause absolute chaos. You would be the expert in this a lot more than I would be, Glen. How do you think it's going to play out?
I'm not an expert in anything, but as someone who imports onto the island of Ireland and indeed to Britain, a tumble out to WTO tariffs will be catastrophic for the UK as a nation. I believe business would be in a similar boat to myself, would be looking at contraction of anywhere between 35 and 55% in the event of a tumble out to WTO tariffs. In the specific of Northern Ireland, well, in fact, not just Northern Ireland, there's no such thing as a good Brexit. Brexit is bad for business. For whatever reason, the UK said, we don't want to deal in a free trade and customs union. We're going to do something different. And they are putting barriers into trading. And there will be a cost consequence to that. And there will be supply chains impacted across these islands because of that. There is no such thing as a good Brexit. The best possible deal is, as Conor alluded to, was probably what Theresa May, the backstop arrangement, had sorted. But the DUP, for whatever reason, went behind Theresa May's back to empower Boris Johnson. And Boris Johnson, again, I would agree with Julianne, has portrayed what would be the notion of a United Kingdom, because Northern Ireland is very much being treated not as part of Britain in what he is doing. It's very much worse than what Theresa May had proposed. But certainly from a purely business point of view, May's proposal was good. Northern Ireland had the opportunity to become a Singapore with a foot in both camps of trade. And that was squandered by one party in Northern Ireland, and that was the DUP.
And what would you think the political implications of that could be? Because people find, I think when we're talking about Brexit, it's something that a lot of people found difficult to comprehend what the impact of it was going to be, but they understood, when you broke it down into very simple terms, when you broke it down into a sea border, when you talked about things like that, I think that people got that. But the DUP had sold this as a sort of regaining of sovereignty, and clearly it's going to be, you know, damaging to everyone, regardless of what community you come from. Mm-hmm. What do you think the political impact of that is going to be in terms of unionism, how unionists vote, and maybe the implication of what the DUP are now going to have to try and salvage the best that they possibly can, given the fact that they promoted Brexit?
Well, if you listen to the likes of Sammy Wilson is blaming Remainers for the situation that we're in, because I don't get Thai, but he's trying to twist the story now that basically the Boris Johnson Betrayal Act, as Unionism sees it, is actually the fault of Remainers. But it's an utter drama. I don't know how they get out of it. You know, they did cheerlead it. They enabled it through the money, the dark money that came via their party, through the propaganda and the publications. Look, everybody, when Brexit happens, whether it's a tumble out the WTO tariffs, or even if we do sort out a trade agreement, everybody in Northern Ireland will be worse off. Our quality of life will shrink. Goods, as Julianne has alluded to, will become more expensive. And in that day, I hope, which will affect everyone, people will remember who were the creators and the orchestrators of this and hold them to account at the ballot box. So I hope that the continual decline for the likes of the DUP and parties of that ilk continues at the ballot box, because it's the only thing that will make them wake up.
I think that one of the biggest issues that we had obviously been facing before, you know, the pandemic swept all that away, was the fact that we didn't have any government here for 3 years. We had the New Decade, New Approach deal in January. They had, you know, a load of you know, a wish list of items that are going to take place to make all our lives better. And then obviously that was swept away. That still exists, and that deal still exists. And what we've seen in the Assembly is that Sinn Féin and the DUP in the main came together and put a very front-facing show of unity on to try and reassure people that they were working together on a health-related business. But as the lockdown eases, as we start returning to so-called normal politics, Louise, do you think that there's a sustainability in that relationship, or obviously the very real differences that exist between those two parties of government, which we have seen through many years, will now start to re-emerge again? You know, as the pandemic lessens, I think that's when we can start to see some of maybe the old cracks in regards to Brexit, in regards to legacy, in regards to lots of other issues that remain unresolved. Do you think that there's a sustainability in this current Assembly? Can it survive those crises in the way it didn't in the past?
I think communication is going to be the key to any sustainability, the extent to which all of the members of the executive can communicate well with each other and work together. You know, it is a construct, it's a political construct that exists in terms of the governing arrangements. And it's always going to be tricky, you know, and I mean, tricky is a word you say, but it's like, what does that actually mean, practically speaking? It's always going to be tough. It's always going to be difficult, because the differences that are there, obviously, as you said, you know, previously they would have come to the fore and been the focus of much commentary. Having said that, I do think the experience of the pandemic has brought all of the parties in the executive closer together, in maybe perhaps not politically, but in terms of the need to come together to do the right thing. And I would hope that spirit will sustain. You know, the sustainability or otherwise of either government on either side, I think either side of the border, depends entirely on the capacity of the people in that government to work together, and also to talk to each other, because that's something that previously would have caused huge difficulties. But I mean, Brexit is going to be absolutely massive, and the impact on it is going to be felt in people's pockets. And as always, when we say the impact is going to be felt in people's pockets, it will be felt the most by the people who have the least, as always. And I think there isn't a person that sits at the executive who doesn't have a responsibility to ensure that they protect their own constituents to the greatest extent possible, and they protect their own communities to the greatest extent possible. I think if the parties can focus on that, I think there is a sustainable future. But the construct that is the governing arrangements in the north it is inbuilt in it. You know, the need to communicate, the need to be upfront, and the need to keep those lines of communication open. But you know, I wouldn't be foolish enough to say the tensions don't exist. We've seen them. We often see them played out in the media as well, which I think is deeply unhelpful. But I would be hopeful that, you know, when facing Brexit, regardless of what side you took in the Brexit argument, and Glen is right, the DUP sold Brexit to people as you know, having potentially economic benefits, which I just think now when we look at it, or even then when we were looking at it, they were never going to be there. Those benefits never existed. Notwithstanding that, there is going to have to be an element of, and it's a phrase I hate and politicians love to say it, but it's the we are where we are. You know, I wouldn't start from here if I was going there, but we are where we are. So they're going to have to come together and deal with it. And I think it is the job of every elected rep in the Assembly to ensure that they come together to minimise the potential impact on their own communities, because mark my words, you know, we were hit hard by the pandemic, north and south, but the potential exists for communities, particularly the north, to be impacted very, very seriously by a no deal Brexit.
We have had an end to the daily briefings, Conor, in relation to Brexit and also in relation to Stormont. There was a fallout, obviously, that existed around the Bobby Story funeral, which meant Darlene Foster and Michelle O'Neill did not appear until quite recently when they attended the North-South Ministerial Conference. But also in the statement put out this week following the death of John Hume, and we have a joint statement from the First Minister and the Deputy First Minister in relation to that, which I suppose is an indication of what a big figure he was in Irish history. Had you ever met John Hume, and what do you think his legacy will be? Or how do you think he will be remembered in the history books?
It was interesting to talk about John Hume in the context of the conversation that we've had about good governance and power sharing at Stormont, because essentially what that needs to function is delivery, leadership and generosity. And John Hume possessed all those things in great quantities, and I was privileged to meet him on several occasions, and I was very honoured, and I'm glad I was able to host an event in recognition of the contribution that he had made at Westminster last autumn for the Irish community in Britain, but also for Pat Hume and for John Jr. and Mo who came across. And what was incredible was just the reach that he has. I mean, we rightly claim John Hume as one of Ireland's greatest, but frankly, in terms of being a beacon for peace and equality and justice, he can be claimed by the whole world, and certainly by the whole of Europe, and his belief in the power of those multilateral institutions to bring people together. And the interesting thing is that in pursuing the goals of non-violence and steadfastly adhering to those, some of the photos that you've seen of John Hume as a young, you know, radical, outspoken defender of his people in his town showed that he possessed no lack of physical courage. He just believed that the best way was through political and democratic means to bring about what fundamentally he wanted, which was the unification of Ireland, but also justice and equality for people living in Northern Ireland, and indeed throughout all of Europe. So I think his legacy is a very strong one. Personally, you know, I think he's spoken of in an Irish context in the pantheon of O'Connell and Parnell, but in a global context alongside King and Gandhi and others, and just the overwhelming number of people who have been inspired by him and his legacy, I think very, very much speaks to that. I also think if people haven't had a chance to watch it, they should watch some of the coverage. I think it was from the BBC Spotlight programme, where he went to the funeral at Greysteel, and where he was approached by one of the families who said that they had prayed for him and urged him to keep working. You know, John Hume was very much inspired by Catholic social teaching, and you know lived a very outworking and gave witness to the gospel. But to think of the personal toll that decades of those sorts of funerals took on him and Pat, and he kept going, and he kept believing, and he kept hoping, and fundamentally he and many others, but particularly he, led from the front and all of that. And so he's a huge loss, and it's a really sad day for people of my generation and all the generations who knew him prior to, and will hopefully remember him subsequent to.
When I was listening to some of the stories, I had met John Hume several times. He could be quite a feisty character as well, you know. But what I recall today, and I was listening to Gerry Adams speaking, and he had talked about how those talks had began way back at the time when we had the killings in Gibraltar, and then the funeral at Milltown and the Michael Stone situation, and then the corporals came after that. And that was a time that I remember so clearly. I always say that one of the reasons I decided to become a journalist was because of the betrayal of my community and the media at that time. I am from here. I remember grown men breaking down and crying. It was a horrific time. But if you watch the documentary 14 Days, where Fowler Alec Reid, who obviously played a key role as an intermediary at that time, will say at the funeral of Kevin Brady, at the funeral with the corporals, there's a picture of Fowler Alec Reid giving the last rites to one of the corporals at a waste ground quite close to where I'm from. And he talks about how he had went to that funeral to get a letter from Gerry Adams, which he was to then pass to John Hume because he was acting as the go-between. And when he took the letter out to hand it to John Hume, it had blood on it from where he'd given the last rites to one of the corporals. And I thought when you think about that in terms of the power of what was trying to be achieved, and this awful place that we live in now, and we judge historic events sometimes in a modern context, but if I remember, when I remember back to how it felt to be alive at that time and how terrifying it was to be growing up in West Belfast at that time, and what an awful situation, and how that peace helped change, I think, all our lives. And I suppose that those words that, of Father Alec Reid, at him taking that risk, of Gerry Adams taking the risk, of John Hume taking the risk, and those three men, coming together to start something which has made my children's lives better. And my children did not live the life that I lived, and they lived it for the reason that those people took those steps. I think that you're slightly younger than most of the people who are in this room, Julianne.
Thanks.
But how do you think in terms of how Unionism viewed John Hume? And also, I think a lot of the conversations that I've been having since he has died have been with David Trimble too, and the steps that were taken among Unionism to try and bring peace. How do you think his legacy will be viewed in that respect?
Yeah, I think I was 10 at the signing of the Good Friday Agreement. I have absolutely no recollection of the Troubles. I have no experience, no stories to share. My mum kept myself and my sister very well sheltered from all that was going on. I think the first time that I actually confronted the past, and it was listening to other people's stories on a Good Relations programme that I was on, and some of it was pretty traumatic and quite shocking to listen to, never mind experience. So I didn't know John Hume in the same way that I don't know David Trimble. But I know of them. I know of John Hume's legacy, and in fact I know what it feels like to grow up in a society that doesn't have those bloody scenes that was experienced by so many in the Troubles here, and for that I'm thankful and I'm grateful for the courage and the efforts the courage that it took, blood, sweat and tears on their part also, for bringing about peace. Younger generation don't really have any kind of lived experience. It's handed down, isn't it?
Yeah, but I do think when you look back, although they don't have the experience of it, they're living it, because my children didn't have the discrimination and the barriers in their way that I had. They could be whatever they wanted to be. Yeah. They could go wherever they wanted, and they could achieve whatever they wanted to be, and that was because of that. If you go back, that dates back to that civil rights movement. It doesn't, it dates back far further than that. They have just been managed to be the ones that, were able. And I suppose, in terms of how all our lives changed, in terms of equality and how women are treated and how all sorts of other people are treated in the workplace, I think it all dates back to those days.
Even from how Unionism viewed John Hume. I was looking through social media just before I came here today, reading all of the comments, and I noticed from a loyalist account had tweeted with their own memory of John Hume, and they'd said that when they were parading through Derry, how John was standing and waving and smiling at them. It was almost like he was welcoming them into his city, into his home. And how that memory had stuck with him, So it was. I think it's fair to say that, unlike some others who would call themselves leaders, John Hume commanded respect rather than demanded it, and he done that across the board.
Louise, in terms of how he's viewed in an all-island context, I suppose we have had the loss of a number of major figures who were part of that peace process, but he is one of those sort of instrumental ones. Went to that sort of Hume Adams talk. It changed our lives forever, didn't it?
I grew up in a border town. As you can tell by my accent, I'm a Dub, but I spent a long time living along the border as a child, and I do have very vivid memories of going to Newry for swimming and being regularly going across the border. My dad was a union organiser for an all-island union, and he would have organised members both sides of the border. I think, there's a danger that we would slip into maybe remembering John Hume as some kind of a cuddly character. He was a man who was he was a man who was outraged by
Totally.
you know, and that was what drove him. And you know, the same as Conor, I'm looking at those pictures on social media. I don't remember them in real time. I'm not as young as Julianne. I'm not old enough to remember the black and white pictures in real time. But when you're looking at those pictures, you're looking at a very brave and courageous man who was a risk taker, you know, who wasn't afraid to stand up, and who spent his entire life outraged by injustice. And I think that's his legacy. And it's not just you know, a north and south. He's a figure that will be remembered and revered worldwide. I think, and you can see that with the outpouring of support. And I know myself, when I was tweeting this morning, I wanted to tweet condolences to his family and to just say that I hope they will get some sort of comfort, some small comfort from looking at the extent to which their dad, Pat's husband, their uncle, their cousin, their friend, a person from their community, the extent to which he was revered across the world. Because I don't think that, you know, that maybe we don't get that so much. You know, it's only when you're abroad, say, like, for example, I remember being in America with Gerry Adams, and you kind of get a sense that, you know, these men, the men from that peace process and the women from that peace process, they are towering figures internationally in a way that maybe we don't kind of think about it so much, you know, here in Ireland. But I do think, you know, that his legacy is huge. We'll spend the next couple of months and indeed the next probably couple of years talking about it. And I do think, though, the danger is that we might slip in to start to say, well, you know, he was a kind of a grandfathery kind of cuddly figure, and he wasn't. He was a man who spent his entire life outraged by injustice, and I think that is his enduring legacy, you know. And he was a risk taker. Gerry Adams said that himself, and I think it's been said by others. He took risks, he was brave, and you know that deserves to be remembered.
And Glen, you did meet John Hume?
Yes, on quite a few occasions. Primarily in the period 1994, 1998, in the talks and negotiations that led to the Belfast Agreement. But yeah, I mean, John, I can't add really to what has been said by Conor and Louise and yourselves. It's, you know, he was a huge man of, you know, intense personal integrity and ethics about social injustice. Because, you know, okay, he's painted as a nationalist leader, but John himself didn't care if you were from the Unionist background or the Orange background. He was concerned about social injustice. And, you know, he worked all his days, and as Louise has pointed out, you know, the risks back then in the 80s of doing those talks with the provost, with Gerry as the conduit with the provost, you know, and just your description earlier about Fowler Alec Reid and the letter and so on, and in this day of mass and immediate communication, to think that is how a peace process was being conducted is actually, you go, whoa, that's really antiquated. You know, and it's, I suppose it's a period of time in our history, but there's absolutely no doubts that John Hume risked his life and everything else to deliver what was the foundation stones of our peace process.
Look, with that, I think that brings us to an end. This has been a very strange West Belfast Talks Back. Usually it takes place in a room with quite a rowdy audience who like to make themselves heard. I'm always very proud to be hosting any Féile events, being a West Belfast woman myself. This is where I feel most at home. But I'd just like to thank all our panellists. I'd like to thank Conor for joining us. I know that you're a busy man, as you know, in these times. Louise as well. I'm sure that your in tray is got plenty in it to keep you going. But thank you very much for taking the time, Julianne. Thank you so much for being here, and to Glen. And thank you for anyone who is listening. And hopefully this time next year we'll be back to normal service. And we'll have plenty of people raising their hands and asking questions rather than just having to listen to me.
On behalf of our panellists, Alison, I'd like to thank our chair.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.